So today's lecture, you're able to see my screen, correct? Okay, thank you. So today's lecture, we are going to shift gears. So the last several lectures have all been on the nervous system, the senses which go along with the nervous system. Now we are going to completely change and we're going to shift over to skeletal system. So today is skeletal. Next week is articulation to joints. And the week after that is muscle. So this is going to be completely different than what we've been talking about. So when we talk about the skeletal system, we're talking about bones. And bones have quite a few functions. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not. So the first function of bone or the skeletal system is support. Can you think of an example of how the skeletal system or bone helps support our body?
It holds up everything. We walk because of our skeletal muscles.
Right. So if you've ever seen someone, if you watch sports long enough, eventually you'll see someone try to walk on a broken leg, and it doesn't work all that well. It's kind of gruesome looking, right? The bones hold us up. The legs allow us to stand up. If I hold my arm out like this, the bone is supporting my arm, right? If without that bone wasn't there, my arm would just flop down. What about protection? It's an example of protection.
Your ribs.
Yes. So I'm very glad you said that first. Actually, it looks like two of you did, because the very next slide shows the skull being protection. And so I was going to ask you, well, other than the one that the slides show you, what's another example? And that is ribs. What do the ribs protect?
The lungs and all that around there.
Yeah, the lungs and all that around there. So the ribs protect everything in here. And so anything that hits us in the chest, we're going to be protected by the ribs. Now we'll see on the next slide, our skull also protects our brain. Can anyone think of an example of bones that protect something other than the skull or the ribs? Those are the two easy ones. I can think of another more difficult one.
The vertebrae, the spinal cord.
That is exactly what I was thinking of. Yes. The vertebrae, which we haven't learned about yet, there's a hole in them that the spinal cord runs through. And so not only does the vertebrae support our body and allow us to bend, but they are protecting that spinal cord. The spinal cord is almost as important as our brain. And our brain has a skull specially designed to protect it. We have to protect that spinal cord also, which is why it runs through the vertebrae. Now, movement. We wouldn't normally think of the skeletal system as being for movement. And the skeletal system doesn't directly cause movement. That is the muscular system. But the skeletal system allows movement. If I don't have a skeleton and I'm just a pile of muscle, I'm just going to sit there and twitch. And I'm not going to move anywhere. The muscles move the bone, which allows us to provide or exert force on our surroundings, which allows us to move. The last two on this list are things that you might not think of as functions of bone, but are very, very, very important. Bone is our bank for storing minerals, primarily calcium and phosphate. Calcium, I'm sure you probably know calcium is involved with bones because we drink or take calcium supplements to promote strong bones. But calcium is very, very important in a lot of other functions in our body. We didn't talk about it too much, but calcium is very important in the function of neurons. Neurons can't function without the proper amount of calcium. Muscles are the same way. We'll learn about that in a couple weeks. Muscles cannot function properly if the calcium concentration in our body is incorrect. Whether it's too high or too low, neither the nervous system or the muscular system is going to be able to work correctly. And so we take calcium that comes into our body. If we have too much calcium in our blood, we're going to take it out of the blood and put it into our bones. If we have not enough calcium in our blood, we're going to take calcium out of our bones and put it into our blood. We'll talk about that. I think it's the very last slide tonight, but it's a pretty unique, unique's not the right word, interesting or focused system to maintain calcium levels in our body. And finally, the thing you wouldn't associate at all with bones, but bones exist to create new blood cells. This is going to happen in bone marrow, which is going to be inside of our bones. And we'll talk about the different forms of bone marrow that we have and what their functions are. So this was the slide I was referring to, showing the skull protecting the brain. We don't need to talk about that any further. This is bone marrow. Well, again, we'll talk more about bone marrow later on, I think. But bone marrow is where blood cells are made. Both red blood cells and white blood cells. The process of making red blood cells is called hematopoiesis, which is the word at the top of your slide here. The picture is showing the head of a femur. And now I know we haven't learned bones yet, but the femur is your thigh bone. And the femur has a big ball on the end that fits into your hip. And so what you're looking at in this picture here is that ball on the end of the femur that fits into your hip. And so that ball can rotate all over the place. And so you're looking at that bone and you're seeing the bone marrow inside. And they have labeled two different types of bone marrow there. Red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. Red bone marrow is where red blood cells are going to be made. That is also where some white blood cells are made. Some white blood cells are made outside of the bone. Yellow bone marrow is used for fat storage. Now, the amount of fat stored in our bones compared to the amount of fat stored outside of our bones is very small. The reason we store fat there is more as a placeholder. This yellow bone marrow used to be functional bone marrow. But as in children, it was functional bone marrow. As we got older, we didn't need it anymore. And so we've converted it from functional red bone marrow to yellow marrow. We'll put some fat in there as a placeholder because as a child, we're growing. Not only do we need to replace the blood cells that get old and die, but we need to constantly increase the amount of blood that we have. And so we need to make a lot of red blood cells. As an adult, though, all we have to do is maintain a constant level. And so we don't need to crank out as many, and so we're able to convert some of it to yellow bone marrow. When we talk about the skeleton, we refer to two sub-portions or subdivisions of the skeletal system, the axial and appendicular skeleton. Now, in this figure, I think we had this in a different lecture. I remember pointing this out, that they made the two different subdivisions different colors, but they're very, very similar colors. So the axial skeleton is the skull, the spine, the ribs coming down, and then the very base of our pelvis. The appendicular skeleton refers to our appendages. And so it is our arms and our legs, and that includes our shoulders and our hips. For the most part, the bones in males and females are the same. A male finger bone is going to be more or less the same as a female finger bone. There could be very, very small differences between them in length and width, but functionally and design-wise, they're going to be the same. The exception to that is the pelvis. The male and female pelvis are very different. Well, very is not probably a good word. They are quite different from each other. There's a number of ways that they're different. We'll talk again about this in the skeletal system lab. And in that case, there'll be a diagram, and I'll kind of point some of these things out. But one of them is how heavy the bones are in the male and the female. The bones in the male pelvis are heavier, they are thicker, whereas in the female, they are lighter and thinner. Can you think of a reason why we would want this to be the case? So someone said birth. How does birth affect this? How does this difference in bone thickness help birth?
Like when the baby's coming out, it's easier for them to get through the pelvis?
Yeah. And so the baby needs to get out, right? Just like she said. And if the thinner the bone is, the more room there is between the bones, right? And so my next question is, well, so why not just make both male and female bones light and thin?
Are men more muscular, so they would need heavier bones?
So you're both correct, and so men are more muscular. They tend to be taller, they tend to be heavier, and so that's more weight going on their pelvis. So which would be what he said about putting more force on their pelvis. So not only about activities, think about when evolution was occurring. Nowadays, men and women may not, for the most part, put different amount of force on their body. But in the olden times, when there were mastodons and stuff running around, most likely it was the males that were out fighting the beasts, right? And so they were more likely to receive damage from what they were doing. And so they were able to withstand that a little bit more. But that also has to go with the weight above the pelvis coming down on the pelvis. And so a bigger person needs a heavier pelvis. I'm not too worried about the pelvic brim. You'll see that in the lab. That you won't be asked about that in a lecture exam or anything like that. The pubic arch is going to be very important in the lab. To me, that is the easiest way to tell the difference between a male and a female pelvis. It's easy to say the female pelvis is larger and the male pelvis is smaller. But the problem you run into is not everyone is the same size. A large female may have, a small female may have the same size pelvis as a large male. You need to compare apples to apples. However, the pubic arch angle is a very unique, very obvious point at the bottom of the pubis. And if you look at that, if you look at a male and a female, from that point forward, you can easily tell the difference between a male and a female pelvis. There are some slight differences in the base of the spine, the sacrum and the coccyx between the male and the female. So the female sacrum is shorter and less curved anteriorly, so towards the front. So I'm going to come back to this slide. And so this is the sacrum right here. And so what do you think is the advantage for the female to have a shorter one and the male to have a longer one? And also the male reaches forward a little bit more at the end and the female is straighter. Any ideas? So this essentially comes back to the same idea. Females, anything in that area in the pelvis of a female has to be designed to allow childbirth. And so you can see in the female on the left, actually they're both female now that I look at it. But on the front, you can see that there's a wide opening here that would allow a baby through. In the male, that would be closed more. And then again, I asked the same question. Well, why not make the male short as well? And that's because the longer it is, the more protective it is. You can see that there's a fair amount of space here that some sort of force could be applied if you were to be hit or you fell or something where you could damage internal organs there. But in a female, you have to balance protection versus childbirth. In a male, you don't have to do that. And so it's going to be as heavy and as long as possible until it starts impeding movement. The same thing goes with the coccyx. The coccyx is the tailbone. And so the female coccyx or the female tailbone is more flexible. So when a woman is pregnant, it starts to move and actually starts to bend back a little bit. And then as the baby is being born, it's able to push that out of the way. Whereas in the male, it's more rigid. It doesn't need to move to get out of the way for a baby. And so by being more rigid, it's going to be more protective. So the next thing we talk about is bone at the microscopic level. So it's easy to think about bone as being rock. That all it is some minerals thrown in there, that it is not alive. But that is really not the case. When you start learning about bone, you realize that it is a very alive, active, complex environment that happens to have some mineral protecting it. So we are going to have 4 primary types of bone cells. We're going to have osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So osteogenic cells are stem cells. These osteogenic cells, think genic like Genesis, which is making, right? These are going to make the other 3 types of cells. So osteogenic cells have no function other than to turn into and make these other types of cells. The other types of cells, osteoblast and osteoclast. When we talk about bone, we have to realize that when we make bone, it is not permanent. We make bone and we also dissolve bone. We are constantly recycling our bone. As bone gets old, it gets brittle. And so we are constantly taking up the bone and laying down new bone. Think about it like resurfacing or replacing a road. The road is cement. It is hard. But over long periods of time, it starts to get cracked and weak. And so we have to take it back up and put down new road. So the type of cell that is going to make bone is called an osteoblast. The type of cell that is going to dissolve, or what we call resorb, or think about it as reabsorb bone, is an osteoclast. Now, I wish these names were reversed, because when I think osteoblast, I think explosion destroying things. But that's not the case. An osteoblast actually makes things. So there's two ways I can suggest remembering this. Either that it is the opposite of what you would think, which is one way, or you might remember that when we talked about tissues and we had fibrous connective tissues, the type of cell that made fibers was a fibroblast. So when we talk about cells, anything blast is a cell that's going to make something. So there are other types of blasts in our body other than fibroblasts and osteoblasts, but they all make something. So an osteoblast makes bone, an osteoclast dissolves bone, an osteocyte is actually able to do the function of both an osteoblast and an osteoclast. Cells follow a general pattern through here. And I wish this figure would have put them in that pattern, but they didn't. So an osteogenic cell was our stem cell. That is what things start as. For the most part, an osteogenic cell makes osteoblasts. Osteoblasts then become osteocytes, basically by gaining the ability to dissolve bone without losing its ability to make bone. And then osteocytes are capable of turning into specifically osteoclasts by losing their ability to make bone. So of those types of cells, which one makes bone?
Osteoblasts.
Osteoblasts, yes. What do osteoclasts do?
Resorbs bone.
Resorb bone. Osteocytes do what? What do osteocytes do?
Maintains.
They maintain bone, which requires both dissolving and making. Now, we did not talk about chondroblasts. We have talked about chondroblasts in another lecture. It was quite a while ago. Does anyone remember what chondroblasts do? So it's a blast. So what does the fact that it's a blast tell you? It makes something, right?
Chondrocytes?
Say it again.
Chondrocytes?
Yeah, so this one is misleading. So chondro is not something that you normally think of. You might associate already osteo with bone. You might see commercials for osteobiflex, right? Chondro, though, you don't hear about. Chondroblasts make cartilage. So when we learned about cartilage in our tissue lecture, I think we talked about chondroblasts. When we talk about bone, there are actually two different types of bone. There is spongy bone and there is compact bone. When you picture bone, you are picturing compact bone. You may not even have known spongy bone exists. Spongy bone is inside of compact bone. The compact bone is a protective layer on the outside of the bone. And so if you were to just look at a bone, you wouldn't realize that there was a whole nother world inside of that bone. You would assume that what you see goes all the way through. But that is not at all the case. When you cut that open, you're going to see spongy bone, you're going to see red bone marrow, yellow bone marrow, blood vessels, nerves, all kinds of things. Spongy bone gets its name because it literally looks like a sponge. That's what we're seeing at the top of this bone here, this red part here. That is spongy bone filled with red bone marrow. And so the white kind of matrix looking area is the spongy bone, and the red in between the bone is the red bone marrow. So here we've zoomed in on it, and you can see it's a whole network of branches of bone. Those little branches are called trabecula. So you take a whole bunch of trabecula, make a meshwork out of it, and you get spongy bone. But there's also that compact bone. And again, like I said, this is what you picture when you think of bone. But even that is not some dead rock of a mineral. There is blood vessels, there are nerves, there are cells. It's a complex system even within that compact bone. So what I want you to look at in this figure in the top right is notice that the compact bone is made up of a series of circular complexes. Each of those circular complexes is called an osteon. And then there are a number of circles within that osteon. So the osteon, it kind of looks like a dartboard with a hole in the middle for the bullseye and then a number of circles going around it. And so the hole in the middle, it's got to be labeled on here somewhere. I'm not seeing where they labeled the middle. There it is. The middle is the central canal. So that is literally a hole running through there. And running through that hole are blood vessels and nerves. And so when we draw figures, just out of convention, we make blood vessels red and blue, depending on whether they're leaving the heart or coming back to the heart. And we make nerves yellow. And so we can see that there are blood vessels and nerves running through this central canal. And then we have the different circles going around that central canal. Those are called concentric lamella. So in this figure, what we're looking at is we've taken a bone and we're looking at just one little section of it. And so we're seeing the compact bone, and on the left is the outside of the bone, the outside world, and on the right is the inside of the bone. And so you can see where the compact bone transitions into spongy bone. Spongy bone is always inside of the bone. The compact bone is always on the outside. So if you look at what makes up bone, a kind of a macro level, there are organic components and inorganic components. From our chemistry lecture, do you remember what is the difference between organic and inorganic?
Isn't organic with the carbon?
Yeah. So organic always means carbon and inorganic means without carbon. And so with carbon is going to be things that you normally associate with life. Cells are full of carbon because the DNA and the protein and the lipids and all of that stuff, those are organic molecules. And so all of the cells and all of the bone cells, the osteoblast, the osteoclast, all of that, and also the cells that make up the blood vessels and the nerves and everything like that, that is organic. But there's also inorganic minerals. That's the calcium and the phosphorus. That's the hard white stuff that makes bone bone. So I mentioned before that we had the two types of bone marrow. And we said that the red bone marrow is where the blood cells are made. The red bone marrow is almost exclusively in the axial skeleton. So in this figure, we've made the axial skeleton red. Can anyone find someplace in that diagram, I see two of them, where there is red bone marrow in the appendicular skeleton?
The hips and the shoulder parts.
Yes, yes. So the hips, we have the hips. Remember, the pelvis was technically considered the appendicular skeleton. And notice that the head of the femur here, which is definitely part of, and that's your thigh bone, so that's definitely part of your leg. I'm doing it again. You cannot see that I'm grabbing my thigh. I realize that's not helpful to you. And also the very head of your arm. That is red there also. But for the most part, it is in this part of your body. It's not in your arms and your legs, other than the very base of them. Yellow bone marrow is, like we said, where lipid is stored, but it's not. The lipid is stored there as a placeholder, not for energy storage per se. It is in what's called the diaphysis of the long bones. Now, long bones are descriptive. If you look at a bone, if it's long and skinny, it is a long bone. What the diaphysis is has not been defined yet. We're going to talk more about that later, and it'll be very obvious. But basically, it is the center. Where's my pointer? It is the center of a long bone, not the ends of a long bone. When we look at bones, we can classify them based on shape. This is pretty easy. We have long bones. Long bones are long and skinny. They are longer than they are wide. We have short bones, which are basically the same dimensions all around. They look like kind of like ice cubes. An example of that are the bones in our wrists and our ankles. You can see that in this picture here. We have irregular bones, which are bones that don't fall into any of the other categories. We have sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are buried into tendons. They're buried in tendons and ligaments. An example of that is your patella or your kneecap. See, it is not connected to any other bone. It is buried in connective tissue, and then it is able to move around a little bit. Our book here throws the sternum out as being its own unique thing. I've never seen another book do that. Everyone else classifies it as simply an irregular bone. So basically you have long bones, short bones, sesamoid bones, which is really just the patella. And if you don't fall into any of those categories, you're an irregular bone. So do you remember what the carpal region was, which would tell you what the carpal bones are? Yeah, it's the wrist. And so the wrist bones were what shape?
Short.
They were short bones. Yeah. Think of carpal tunnel. That's the wrist. That's a problem with your wrist. And so carpal bones are your wrist bones. What slide are we on? 16. What's coming up? I think this is a good spot for a break. We're a little early, but I think this is a good spot for a break, and we're going to finish pretty early. So let's take a break. It says 6:46 now. Let's take a 6:47. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll restart at 6:52. Has anyone had any problems with their fall courses? I know our department is taking basically everything and putting it online. It's going to be like 3/4 online, 1/4 in person. In my opinion, that's all it is an opinion. I think other than courses that have to be done on in person, like labs and things, I think it's best to just do everything online. I mean, at some point, some of like chemistry labs and microbiology labs, even in that case, you could probably do some of it online, but then you get into some of the clinical courses. Some of you might be going into nursing. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go into the hospital sick and get a nurse that learned all of these techniques online, and all of a sudden she's trying to put an IV into my arm, and she said, well, I watched a YouTube video on it, it'll be fine. So online, how do the online clinicals work? Interesting. At some point, I'm sure you can do some of it, but at some point, you just gotta, you gotta do it. To be honest, I'm glad I don't have to do it, and I'm glad it's not my decision to force people to do it, because that's not a situation I would want to be in. New function for a USB port. Yeah. So, if you have some in-person work previously, then you're probably fine. But the longer this drags on, you're going to get people who have never had in-class or in-person training. So our department at UF teaches pharmacology classes to the med students and the dental students and the PA students. And so all of our stuff can be done online, but we talk about, if you're a dental student, you have to learn how to do fillings and root canals and crowns and all of that stuff. And watching a video or doing it, even if they mailed you some sort of simulator, it's not the same as doing it on a person. And you can't give someone a medical license when they haven't actually done it. So I don't know how that's going to work. Looks like the storm is getting weaker and going east. Gonna hit Palatka, not us. So, lucky for you, class will not get cut short. So it's been 5 minutes. I'm guessing everyone's probably back. So when we look at a long bone, we like to break it into parts. And we have words and terms that describe the parts of a long bone. One of them that we've already talked about is the diaphysis. The diaphysis is the shaft of the long bone. It is the long, skinny part in the middle of the long bone. On the ends, on each end, we have an epiphysis. And so the plural of epiphysis is epiphyses, which is the word on our slide here. And so we have a diaphysis in the middle and then two epiphyses on the end. Where the diaphysis and the epiphysis come together, where we draw that line, in this case there is a distinct line that separates them. It's not a kind of a whale. This is kind of the middle, so it's a diaphysis. This is kind of the end, so it's an epiphysis. There is a literal line there where we draw a distinction between the two. In a child that is still growing, that line is the epiphyseal plate. In an adult that is no longer growing, it is called the epiphyseal line. And so the epiphyseal line and the epiphyseal plate are the border between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. They are the same structure, except in a child it is a plate and it is growing. In an adult it is a line and it is not growing. This is something I wish you could see, because in lab we actually have a human bone that is cut open, and so you can pick it up and you can look at it and you can see this epiphyseal line, and it is visible to the eye, and I mean it's very easy to see.
Question: is the whatever is it? Do we call it growth plate in like children?
Yeah. So the epiphyseal plate.
Growing?
What was the second part there?
So, like that's why it's a plate. Call it a growth plate, and in children, if you break it, it stops growing.
Yeah, and so the epiphyseal plate is the growth plate. They're the same thing. We'll see how this plate grows later on in another slide. But like she said, if you're a child and you break the epiphyseal plate, for the most part, it is going to stop growing. It's not going to necessarily completely stop, but it is going to grow less. And so you might run into someone who, when they were young, they broke their leg or their arm, and so one is longer than the other. If we look at a long bone, we also have some protective membranes. Think of this like the duramater and the pia mater of the nervous system. These are protective membranes. One is on the outside of the bone. One is on the inside of the bone. The one on the outside is the periosteum. The one on the inside is the endosteum, and it is going to line the inside of the bone here. So you can see where we have the compact bone on the outside, and then we have the spongy bone in the middle. The endosteum is going to line the spongy bone. So there's going to be basically a hole in the center of that bone where the bone marrow is going to be. There's going to be some spongy bone there potentially, and then it's going to be lined by the endosteum. They've also labeled here the medullary cavity. There is some spongy bone here in the diaphysis. The epiphyses are completely filled with spongy bone, but the diaphysis is not completely filled. There is some there, but there's also some just completely empty space. And that is the medullary cavity. And that would be full of yellow bone marrow. So this is the periosteum and endosteum. This doesn't really add anything to what we were just talking about. And this takes everything, puts it all together, and shows it to us again. So we have a diaphysis in the middle, epiphyses on the end. In this case, they've labeled them the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis, and so closer or further away from the connection point. In this case, this is a femur. I can tell by the shape. And so this end would be connected to the hip. This end would be the knee. This figure labels this area where the epiphyseal line is as the metaphysis. We are not concerned about that term. So I would, for us, we're going to consider that part of the epiphysis. We can see the spongy bone that's inside the epiphysis. The epispongy bone also contains red bone marrow. We can see the medullary cavity in the middle, this open area that's filled with yellow bone marrow. They've cut the yellow bone marrow here so you can see the empty cavity, but the yellow bone marrow would normally come all the way up. We can see where they're kind of peeling away the periosteum on the outside of the bone. They're pointing to the endosteum that's lining the medullary cavity here. We'll talk more about this next week with the articulations and joints, but the ends of long bones also have this articular cartilage. You're going to have this on the end of long bones where there are joints. And that's because cartilage is softer than bone. And joints, we don't want to have bone on bone. That is arthritis. And so cartilage is smooth, it's soft, it's a little bit shock absorption, and so we want cartilage on cartilage. So we put cartilage on the end of each long bone, and then we put two of those together, and now we have cartilage on cartilage. So next thing we talk about is how we make bone. There are two primary types of bone manufacturing. And so the process of making bone is called ossification. We have intramembranous ossification and we have endochondral ossification. The primary type of bone growth is going to be the endochondral. And the endochondral is the easier one to understand. This is the one that's going to happen at the growth plates. The intramembranous ossification is the more complex. It's not as common. It's only going to be in the flat bones of our body, which include our skull and our clavicles. And so the skull bones and our clavicle, which is shoulder bones. And so intramembranous ossification is going to make bone from what we call mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is embryonic tissue. And so this is going to be cells, basically stem cells that are left over from when we were an embryo. This is going to take this soft cells and use those soft cells and make bone. It's actually going to be spongy bone. Endochondral ossification, though, takes cartilage and turns it into bone. It's basically like taking a tree and turning it into a petrified tree. It is a solid object that we're putting minerals into to make it hard and basically make it a stone. And this is going to be all bones other than our flat bones. So this is the intramembranous ossification. Like I said, this is a fairly complex process. We are not concerned about the details of this. You do not have to memorize this little set of steps down at the bottom of this figure. What you need to know is that intramembranous ossification makes flat bones. It primarily is going to make spongy bone and is going to end up making a bone that is a sandwich of spongy bone between two layers of compact bone. And so we see that in the last figure in the bottom right here. There's spongy bone in the middle, and then there's compact bone on the top and the bottom. So that's intramembranous ossification. Here again we see that flat bone. This is a skull bone. We see the spongy bone very clearly in the middle of that. And then there is compact bone on the top and the bottom. So what did we say was the primary function of skull bones?
To protect the brain.
To protect the brain. Now, if the primary function is protection, it would seem to me that one thick layer of compact bone would be better protection than this. Why do you think it is this rather than one thick layer of compact bone?
No red blood cells.
So this allows us to put some red bone marrow in there, but let me be kind of the devil's advocate and say, well, what if we take the red bone marrow out of there and just stick it into the... I mean, we got rid of the red bone marrow in the arm. Why not just remove it from the skull and put it into the arm? Somebody said make the bones lighter. A couple people said make bones lighter. So yeah, if we make one thick layer of compact bone, the skull is going to be heavier. So we're not going to be as agile as we could be. Now let me again be devil's advocate and say, well, if the skull is heavier, why not just make more muscle to move the lighter head around? Could there be another advantage to this? Expansion? Nah. So kind of actually the opposite of that. Look at that picture and imagine you put you get hit on the outside of the skull. What do you picture happening there? If you take two wood boards, and you put a sponge between them, and you put some force on top, what's going to happen?
The sponge will take the impact.
Yeah, shock absorption. And so if you have one big thick layer of compact bone, it's going to be very strong. It will be. There's no other way around that. But it's not going to be very good at absorbing shock. It's going to be able to absorb a lot of force, but not a lot of shock. Here, you're going to get some of this that can go on. And so here, we can take that. If you have compact bone, either it is going to take it or it's going to crack. And there's nothing in between. I don't know if any of you like to fish, but there's two primary types of fishing line. There's monofilament, which is the plastic stuff you're used to, and there's something called braid. Monofilament is the plastic stuff, like I said. It stretches quite a surprising amount. And so monofilament is not as strong. It can't hold as much weight as braid. But when you set the hook and you put a lot of force into it, it likes to stretch. And so it doesn't want to break when you set the hook. Braid, though, it doesn't stretch at all. And so even though it can hold a whole lot of weight, it has a tendency to break when you set the hook and you put a whole bunch of force on it all at one time. The same thing is happening here. Compact bone could maintain more force without breaking, but when you get hit, it's just not going to handle that very well. And so we found the happy middle with two layers of compact bone and the spongy bone in the middle. So that was into intramembranous ossification with the flat bone. Our long bones are made through endochondral ossification. And again, there's a lot of detail on this slide that you don't need to know. What I do need you to know is to realize that endochondral ossification happens at the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate, and that the way it works is when we want to grow the bone and make it longer, we put down some cartilage. And so imagine we have the diaphysis here and we have the epiphysis here. If we insert some extra cartilage here that pushes the epiphysis up a little bit, and then we convert that cartilage into bone. And so endochondral ossification puts down cartilage, and then we convert that cartilage into bone. It's a two-step process. Keeping that in mind, keeping how that process works in mind, why do you think children tend to break their bones at the growth plate rather than somewhere like in the diaphysis? Any ideas? So at the growth plate, what type of material is there? How did we say endochondral ossification works? What were the steps? So it's soft. Why is it soft? So in endochondral ossification, there you go. The cartilage hasn't been fully calcified. And so we make cartilage. Cartilage is hard, but it's not as hard as bone. And then we, over time, convert that cartilage into bone. And so on the bone, where there's some cartilage is going to be the weak spot. And so if you fall and you catch yourself with your arm, the bone is going to break in the weakest spot, which is going to be at the growth plate. So, of our two types of bone formation, which type of bone was made by intramembranous ossification?
Flat.
Yes. Answer is flat bones. If we look at the long bones, so flat bones are only made through intramembranous ossification. We saw long bones being made longer through endochondral ossification. But long bones also have intramembranous ossification. Bones, as we get older and we grow, they have to get bigger around also. They have to get longer. But as they get longer, they have to get bigger. Think of a tree. As the tree gets taller, it also gets wider. So in a long bone, they get wider through intramembranous ossification. They get longer through endochondral ossification. So here we see that longitudinal bone growth, where the bone is getting longer. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing the conversion from the growth plate, which is live cells, where they make cartilage. That cartilage gets older, the cells die, and then it gets calcified. That's all that figure is showing you. It's showing you that as we get further away from the growth plate, we get less and less cartilage, less live cells, and then we can go into bone with bone cells rather than the cells that we started with that made the cartilage. This is just showing that they change from an epiphyseal plate to an epiphyseal line. There's nothing new here, but they show you where these are. And so you can see that they exist even in the adult. You can see them. They're visible. It's just nothing is happening there. Like I mentioned earlier, bones constantly are being remade. Once we make a bone, it does not stay there. That's what we mean by static. Static means not moving, not changing. We're constantly making new bone. We dissolve, we resorb the old bone, we put new bone down. So we have kind of a normal rate in which this happens, but there are some situations where we can speed up this process. Has anyone had an example where something has happened that has made their bones stronger? So something that people like to say is when they break a bone, once it's healed, it's actually stronger than it was before you broke it. And that's because our body is smart enough to realize that if I broke this bone, it must not be strong enough. And so when I rebuild it, I'm going to make it stronger so that it doesn't want to break again. When we exercise, we are constantly putting tiny little microscopic fractures in our bone, which causes that bone to be remodeled faster and stronger. So this is something that astronauts have problems with. When they go into space and they don't have gravity, they don't have the force, even just walking around, we're putting stress on our bones and tiny little cracks in them. So when they get back, they have problems with weak bones. They have to go into physical therapy to exercise just the right amount to strengthen their bone. If they overdo it, they're at risk of breaking bones. And so while they're up there, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures where they have a treadmill and then they have basically these rubber bands that are holding them down on the treadmill. It's putting force on their legs so that they can exercise and try to keep their legs strong while they're up in space. So I think, yeah, this is our last slide. So this is that mechanism of maintaining calcium levels in the body. There is an equal mechanism for maintaining phosphorus in our body. We're not going to learn about it though, but it works basically the same. And so in this situation, we have calcium in our blood, we have calcium in our bone, we have receptors that are able to measure how much calcium is in our blood, and then we have hormones that can be secreted by glands that are going to cause the calcium to move either from the blood to the bone or from the bone to the blood. And so we have two hormones. One is parathyroid hormone, which gets made by the parathyroid. And we also have calcitonin, which is made by the thyroid. Now, before you get mad at the people that made these, say, well, why not call it thyroid hormone? That's because there is thyroid hormone, and it's not this one. The thyroid makes multiple hormones. The parathyroid only makes one. And so, parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid gland. It gets made when the blood calcium level, so the amount of calcium in our blood, gets too low. So if the calcium levels in our blood gets too low, the parathyroid is going to make parathyroid hormone, which gets abbreviated PTH. We see that in the diagram here, which is going to cause the osteoclasts in our bone to pick up and be activated. Remember, osteoclasts destroy or resorb bone. If you destroy bone, that calcium has to go somewhere, and it's going to go into the blood. And so we basically dissolve some of our bone to put the calcium back into the blood. That can cause problems, right? If we take too much calcium out of our bones, they become weak. But if the calcium in our blood gets too low, our neurons and our muscles are not going to work. And we can't live if our neurons and our muscles don't work. We can live with weak bones until we get damaged or we break them, right? And so it's a kind of a catch-22, but you know you're going to die if your neurons don't work. And so you have to sacrifice the bones to make the neurons happy. If the calcium in our blood gets too high, that's also going to prevent the neurons in the muscles from working properly. And so in that case, the thyroid, which is going to make a hormone called calcitonin, calcitonin is going to cause the calcium in the blood to get put into the bone. So it's going to make the bone stronger by taking the calcium out of the blood and putting it into the bone. These work together to maintain calcium homeostasis. We have a normal level of calcium that we want in the blood. If it goes too high, we make calcitonin to take the calcium out of the blood and put it into our bone to bring us back to normal. If we go too low, we make parathyroid hormone, which takes calcium out of the bone, puts it back into the blood to bring us back into normal. Usually, we stay in a fairly tight window. Unless we have some sort of a calcium shortage, we are not going to have a problem. And so when we eat calcium, it goes into our bloodstream, and then if we don't need it there, we're just going to take it out, put it into our bone. Between meals, maybe our blood calcium starts to drop, we're going to take it back out. So that is the end. Does anyone have questions about the skeletal system? It's a quick one today. Next week's probably going to even be shorter.
So it's good to drink a lot of milk because when the calcium goes into your blood, it goes into your bones, makes your bones stronger. And when your calcium level is low in your blood, it takes from the bone, which has all that calcium from drinking calcium.
Correct. Right. So it's good to a point. Our body is able to tell when we have enough calcium and we don't need more. In that case, the extra will just go out in the urine. But some people who don't have good sources of calcium in their diet, they might get all of their dietary calcium from something like milk. Anything else? Okay. Well, I suggest make sure you're keeping up on your labs. Don't save all of your labs to the end of the semester, because it's going to be one thing after another when you get to the end of the semester, and you don't have to worry about the labs also. So make sure you get working on the skeletal lab. Just get it done with, get it out of the way, so we can move on to articulations next week. So if you end up with any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.